Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of What the FinTech, the podcast from the team behind FinTech Futures and the Banking Technology magazine. My name is Paul Hindle, editor at FinTech Futures, and for this episode we're joined by Sam Edge, Head of Industries and Emerging Technologies, Startups and VC at Amazon Web Services. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Paul. Excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, it's great to have you here. So just get started. We'd like to quickly let us know a bit more about yourself and the work you're doing at AWS.
Yeah, sure things. So I lead a team of specialists to help startups, including fintech startups, be more successful, leveraging our cloud services at AWS and also our many dedicated startup programs. We also work closely with the venture capital community and help them find success with their portfolios. And I've been here for about 5 years. Prior to this, I worked in financial services for about 10 years. And then I moved into startups where, amongst other things, I've been a founder and an early stage venture capitalist myself.
Excellent. Sounds great. And again, great to have you here. And thanks so much for taking time out to speak with us today. On the show this week, we'll be diving into the current fintech startup scene, including some of the emerging technologies that startups and investors are most interested in, how the startup landscape has evolved amid a wider slowdown in fintech investment globally, key advice for fintech founders looking to get started in the current economy and grow their business, and whether positive sentiment is returning in the VC investment space. We'll also hear more about how AWS has been working with fintech startups to support them in their early stages, some of the company's key fintech focus areas, and how the company has approached its fintech and financial services strategy in general. That's all to come shortly, but as always, we'll open with our news in numbers segments. This is where our guest has gone out and found a new story featuring an interesting number to discuss and get us started. So, Sam, what have you brought along for us today?
Yeah, a couple of things actually from me. And I read these while I was lying on a beach in Italy. I've just come back from a lovely week away. And Italy, you may know, is home to the oldest bank in the world, which has amazingly been operating continuously since 1472. And this immediately struck me how young fintech is. But I read a couple of articles around the fact that even though young, the industry is growing up quickly. The first one was the news, firstly, that Revolut has secured its UK banking license after 3 years of trying. And the number here is that they're doing a share sale at a $45 billion valuation. So they're obviously a key player in this young industry, but that valuation makes them more valuable than many incumbents and household names, including Barclays and NatWest. So that's kind of number one. And then the second one is all around open banking, which is an area that I'm certainly very interested in. And the fact that within the UK, open banking has now reached 10 million users, which is pretty awesome. It's been around now for about 6 years, and it's created more than $4 billion worth in value. And so, again, both of those two articles together have kind of demonstrate, I guess, that it's a young industry, but it's also now quite mature.
Yeah, for sure. And there's obviously a lot of talk about the state of the global economy at the moment, as I briefly alluded to at the start as well, Fintech Funding not being at the level of previous years. But do you think these two stories then show that there is plenty to be positive about them when you're looking at kind of the fintech scene, and how do you expect this to continue to mature going forward?
I guess quickly on the funding, because this question comes up quite a lot and it attracts a lot of commentary. I think it's certainly true to say that fintech funding is down, obviously, especially since the highs we saw during and immediately following COVID. But those are fairly kind of unique years. And actually, if you look at the 5-year average, I think it's actually going up over time. And fintech is also more closely impacted, I think, by some of the kind of microclimate that's happening right now than other verticals, particularly within startups. So if you think about kind of global elections, the uncertainty around interest rates, the crunch on household spending, these things have an outsized impact on fintech. And so that number that fintech funding is down, it's a fair comment, but I think there's some context there. And there is some interesting signs, I think, of more positive sentiment coming out in the market. If you look at, for example, Sifted put out their kind of half-one review of the European startup scene recently, in which they found that during Q2 of this year, fintech has now returned actually to be the most funded vertical in Europe, which again is very encouraging. And we're also seeing VCs closing new specialized funds. So something which I read was that 13 Books Capital just closed a 160 million fund focused purely on early stage fintechs in Europe, so seed and Series A. So there are some kind of positive signs coming through. I think the other part of your question was around my perception of the fintech scene more broadly. And I'm kind of bullish on where we're at the moment. Just to kind of maybe make this a bit more interesting and to provide some context, I want to use a bit of a sports analogy here because we're in the middle of this awesome summer of sport. And I've been working in fintech now for about 10 years. And I think if you go back 10 years or so, I would kind of describe fintech as a single sports event with many participants, all of whom were really focusing on a similar sort of thing, serving predominantly a consumer customer base and solving kind of deep-rooted pain points around the customer experience, and then delivering their service through a digital interface using cloud and mobile. If you kind of contrast that to today, the market actually looks very different. In fact, it's no longer a single sports event, very topical, but it's more like the Olympics. We've got lots of different kind of groups competing or collaborating in some cases in very different ways, serving different customer segments, going to market in different ways. And so we still have the challengers, companies like Monzo and Starling, that are now very late stage. In some cases, they're strategizing for IPO. But we also have a cohort of B2B focused fintechs that have also raised a lot of capital recently. Companies offering, for example, banking as a service, open banking, core banking solutions. And rather than competing with incumbents, they're helping incumbents and fintechs through partnership. And then there's some new stuff happening at the early stage, really for the last couple of years. This kind of interlock between the CFO tech stack and fintech. Actually, there's been 3 newly minted unicorns in Europe this year focusing in that space, and some interesting stuff at the kind of convergence of fintech and other trends like climate tech. I think a lot of VCs, though, are kind of waiting for, again, going back to the Olympics, what is going to be the next big event at the Olympics? What's the next big kind of catalyst for growth, which likely, in my view, is going to piggyback off Gen AI and maybe some of the successes of open banking, such as open finance.
You mentioned, obviously, Gen AI there. I mean, that's been a big talking point in financial services for coming on 2 years now. I mean, we've heard a lot about some of the common use cases around kind of chatbots and streamlining manual processes and such. But what new use cases are you seeing emerging there in the fintech space that you think firms need to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, sure. Again, plenty happening here. Before I jump into use cases, I think I want to just point out that Gen AI, I think, has massive potential in financial services. We're seeing a lot of activity in fintech, and there's pretty good reasons for this. There's lots of data in financial services. Fintechs, in particular, have a good understanding of this data. They understand the quality of the data. They understand where it is. They understand how it can be used. And in most cases, we talk a lot about Gen AI right now, but AI machine learning has been kind of pretty rife in the industry for years. And we've got a lot of fintechs that have been using it across the full customer journey. And that set them up for success, I think, when it comes to Gen AI. And we obviously work very closely with customers with their Gen AI strategies. It's been interesting to see how those strategies have changed over time and progressed. If we go back to last year, for example, it was really a year of learning and experimentation. We're now seeing more companies transition from experimentation into production. So maybe to kind of give you some examples on the kind of use case side, I'm certainly seeing more companies now embed Gen AI into their products. So one example is Clio, who you may be familiar with. They're a personal finance management provider. They have a financial assistant that they provide to consumers, and they've now begun to embed Gen AI to make that financial assistant more sophisticated, easier to use. They automate financial analysis, investment recommendations that can then apply to each customer's individual financial situation, nudging them to better behavior. I love that use case because the big promise of fintech for a while has been self-driving money. And I think Gen AI unlocks that if you combine it with open banking data. Likewise, we see companies like Ramp, for example, in the US. They're a spend management platform. They're using Gen AI to provide better insights and easier management for their SMB owners on their business expenses and overall financial management. So, for example, they help their customers review complicated business contracts using Gen AI and also automate expense reports and accounting processes. So there's a lot of stuff happening in that kind of product integration side of things. And then another kind of group of, this is top of mind for me because I've just met a few of them. There's another kind of interesting group coming through that are actually not fintechs. They're kind of specialized core Gen AI companies that sell horizontal solutions into all number of different types of vertical, but they're finding specific traction within financial services. So some examples here include Poly AI, who provide customizable voice assistants so that any organization can build their own chatbot. So there's a kind of common use case there more quickly through partnership. and they're finding traction within financial services, and also Robin AI that provides Gen AI powered legal review, when they found significant traction in capital markets, which often have a lot of repeatable legal contracts, and they can automate those. So they're finding a lot of traction in that space, in particular private equity. If I think about looking forward, I'm just expecting the number of use cases to grow, in particular on the kind of regulated use case side of things, again, across that customer journey, and more kind of consumer facing use cases than we've seen historically.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting space, and it's, like I say, keen to keep an eye on how those going. I mean, other than Gen AI, then what would you say are some of the big focus areas for startups right now? Which emerging technologies or use cases are you seeing getting the most traction?
Yeah, sure. So I think if I kind of go back to my kind of sports analogy and kind of how the market has evolved, I think the kind of focus areas of fintechs are actually quite similar, even as the market has evolved. Companies still have to fund their business. Now, what's changed there has been investor sentiment. We're not in kind of growth mode to the same extent we were a few years ago. And we're still seeing, I think, from many investors, a flight to quality, focus on investing in the best assets, which then increases the amount of due diligence and the kind of requirements of the fintech companies. And Gen AI can be a good tool in that it can help with productivity and help to kind of create better operational excellence. So fund the startup is one kind of key focus area, pretty evergreen. The other one is build the business and making sure that they're continuing to delight their end customers. Again, a big focus again here on embedding Gen AI for the use cases, some of the examples I just gave a moment ago. And then a third piece, which has really come on over the last few years, has been how do you kind of grow your business? How do you get more customers? About 2/3 of funding this year, but really for the last few years, has gone into the B2B segment of fintech. And so there's a really big focus now on enterprise sales, partnering with FSIs, selling into FSIs, and broader kind of go-to-market activity.
Excellent. So, I mean, at AWS, then obviously you're well known for providing cloud solutions for financial services. But I mean, what can you tell us about your fintech strategy, and which technologies in particular have you been looking to tap into you think are showing the most potential?
Yeah, sure. Last time with a sport analogy, I promise. But you can, going on with that vein, you can almost think of us as the support team that's sitting in the corner of the boxing ring, supporting the fighter being the fintech company. And we have a global cross-functional team that's completely dedicated to fintech startups. It's been an area that we've really focused on. And we provide support around account management, solution architects who can really provide better support technically, business developers that can provide ecosystem access and value beyond infrastructure. And the whole team has kind of deep expertise, both in startups and in financial services and fintech. And then where we need to, we bring in other experts from the broader AWS business, for example, from our financial services industry team or our public policy team who work closely with regulators and many others. And the reason we formed this global team was to better address the specific needs of fintech companies, but also to tap into the specialized ecosystems that are forming around fintech. And so coming on to strategy, our strategy continues to reflect the origins of the team and the reason we exist. So firstly, of course, we support fintechs, helping them to leverage our services most effectively for their given use case. And because obviously fintech and financial services is a regulated space, we do that with kind of security, privacy kind of front of mind as kind of job number one. And we help them to embed best practice into everything they do. And then secondly, we go beyond infrastructure. So we go beyond the product side of things and we support them more strategically. So as I mentioned, a lot of funding is going into B2B. And so we have a lot of go-to-market programs that we leverage to help fintech companies, such as our partner network, our marketplace, both of which help companies like Thought Machine, Mumbu, and many others co-sell, co-market alongside AWS. And then we also run a bunch of more kind of curated, specific programs for fintech companies based on their needs. So for the last couple of years, we've been running a fintech accelerator, which helps fintechs accelerate their businesses at the early stage. And we also run a program called Go Global, which helps fintechs move from Europe into North America through business development activity. And then the final part of the strategy is ecosystem-based activity and tapping into the ecosystems that are now quite specialist and quite broad within financial services. This means being active at major conferences and running events there, running our own events. We have our Financial Services Cloud Symposium happening in September. We have our FinTech Executive Forum that we've been running for executives in FinTech for the last couple of years. These provide opportunities for FinTechs to get together, network, and learn from each other. So there's a whole bag of tricks there, but the core piece here is that we're working backwards from the needs of our customers.
Excellent. Yeah, no, sounds very, very comprehensive. I mean, you mentioned the Global FinTech Accelerator there. What's been the outcome of that? And are there any success stories to come from that you can tell us about?
So a bit more context on it, I guess, first. So like I said, we've run a couple of these accelerators in just FinTech over the last couple of years. We also run, for example, a B2B accelerator last year, an emerging tech accelerator last year, a Gen AI accelerator that we're launching, so that we're running now globally. And there's a bunch of FinTech companies that participate in those accelerators as well. But the FinTech accelerator is FinTech focused. And we ran one a couple of years ago just in the UK market, which focused on open banking, FinTech as a service, AI machine learning, embedded finance, really a lot of the trends that were and still are in cases very big at the time. And then the second one was global. We operated it in Europe, North America, and Latin America. And that focused purely on AI machine learning. And in both cases, the accelerators combined access to AWS specialists, experts from within our ecosystem, benefits and offers and credits from AWS to accelerate success for the cohort. So, to give you an example of some of the companies that provided mentorship and run sessions, we had NVIDIA sponsoring our global accelerator, which is natural, obviously, given the AI machine learning focus. It was supported by top investors, including Sequoia, Bain Capital Ventures, Accel, A16Z, Benchmark, Visa, MasterCard. So some really good names and very reputable names in financial services and venture capital. And then we included sessions on technology adoption, go-to-market, partnering with FSIs, how to raise funding, how to build a deck, how to raise investment, and these sorts of things, all of which are very common needs of early stage companies. And in total, we had 200 companies that went through both of those accelerators together. And one company, which I've had the pleasure of working a bit with, is a company called Tokyo. They're an embedded finance platform, and they've raised over 30 million now worth of funding. I was actually at an event a couple of years ago with Excel where they highlighted their top 50 FinTech companies in EMEA, and Tokyo were on that list. And so I was very happy, and they went through our accelerator, and we were part of that journey for them.
Excellent. Yeah. And I mean, I guess you must speak to a lot of FinTech founders and leaders in your role as well. I mean, what tips or advice would you give to budding FinTech founders and looking to get started in the current economy and get that initial bit of funding?
Sure. So I think even though funding is dipping, and we've talked about that, I think new platform shifts like we've seen with the cloud in the past, where there were so many interesting companies that came out. Many of them, started with AWS and have been very successful now. These are great times to go out and build. And we're seeing that, I think, now with AI machine learning. But I think the fundamentals of how to be successful remain the same. And so I think to kind of answer this question, I want to lean a little bit on a set of principles we have at AWS and Amazon, our leadership principles that shape our culture and guide the behavior that our teams exhibit on a daily basis. And these leadership principles have been kind of fundamental to our success. And so I'm going to just select a few of these and then contextualize them for early stage FinTech founders. So the first one is customer obsession. This is a very important principle at Amazon. And so the way I would contextualize this one for FinTech is, regardless of the funding situation, founders need to obsess about the problem they're solving, right? What is the customer problem they're solving, rather than work backwards from a specific technology or a specific solution, which is sometimes there's a risk of doing that, I think, in particular when you have new platform shifts. And there are loads of good examples in the industry of companies that have been successful here. So maybe I'll call out a few that are building on AWS. And these are FinTech of the service providers, companies like Onfido that have just recently exited, Verif, Resistant AI. They all identified a real problem around fraud prevention and identity verification, and now they use AI machine learning so they can solve that problem better. But they've started with the problem, and then they've moved on to the right technology to solve that problem. So I think being kind of obsessed with the problem, I think, is kind of piece of advice number one. The second one is be right a lot, which is a concept that we have at AWS, that successful leaders, or in this case founders, should make the right decisions more often than not. Easier said than done. But I would kind of translate this into a regulated industry like FinTech and financial services around effectively managing that interplay between customer experience and managing risk and compliance, because it's easy to kind of lean too heavily onto the customer experience side, and that can kind of get you into trouble. And I think you need to manage providing experiences that are cheaper, lower friction, more personalized in real time, with having robust processes to manage risk and protect the customer. And so there's been a bunch of companies like Starling and Monzo and Zilch, for example, who do this really well. And maybe just one more, which is ownership, which is, again, another principle we have here at Amazon, that you should own your specific area of coverage. I think in this case, the way I would relay this into a piece of advice is really own the specific problem. What is the value of the company? And then leverage partnerships for areas that are non-core. And we did a piece of work a couple of years ago with Innovate Finance, the industry body here, focused on the partnership economy as we see it within fintech. And I think those partnerships are very core to success. If you can partner for something rather than build it, and if it's not core, and it means you can really focus on that specific customer problem, that specific need, this will increase speed to market and then reinforce that single-minded obsession that's critical to success. There's a bunch of other ones I could go into, but I think those ones are pretty important in where we are as a market today.
Sounds good. And I guess one thing you mentioned obviously earlier is that a lot of the funding is going into like early stage startups these days, so kind of that seed and Series A rounds. But once you've kind of got that initial funding, what would you say the key challenges then for founders when it comes to growing and developing their businesses then to move on to get to that next level? And what advice would you give for them to overcome those?
Yeah, sure. I think some of it is what I just mentioned, but maybe three specific things I'd call out here. One, I think hiring is critical. Again, I don't want to kind of lean too much on our leadership principles, but we have another one called hire and develop the best. And I think that's relevant here. Knowing when to hire, knowing when to move from generalists to specialists as you move from Series A to Series B, I think is critical. Being a developer of talent, of course, as the company scales. And in startups, which are obviously quite small and have quite small teams, this isn't just the skill set you bring in, it's also the culture you bring in. So being kind of clear that you're bringing in somebody that shares that cultural mentality, because ultimately your early hires are going to become leaders. They're going to hire people themselves. And so getting those first hires or that kind of early team established and having the right people, I think is critical. So the first thing is hiring. The second, I think, is around product, continuing to build and develop the product in a very fast moving market, knowing when to build and when to kind of just continue to focus on what you're doing. And then again, doing so with security and privacy and these sorts of things baked in, I think is important. And I think that requires having kind of fast and regular feedback loops from your customer so you can iterate quickly based on their needs. And then, of course, also, as I mentioned before, knowing when product expansion should be a build versus buy decision. And then the third piece, which I've also mentioned, is kind of go to market, which is increasingly becoming a key differentiator within startups more broadly, but also within fintech. And again, this comes back partly to hiring and bringing in the right specialists at the right time, and also knowing when to leverage partnerships. I talked about the Amazon Partner Network, for example. The work that we do as a channel partner to fintechs, co-selling and co-marketing. So those decisions, I think, are also important when to kind of really invest in that. I think is critical to success. I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones, but those ones for me resonate, moving really from, like I said, Series A to Series B.
Excellent. Yeah. And so we have a lot of fintech founders listening to the podcast as well. Let's say that they're listening to this episode, they're hearing what you're saying, they're thinking, oh, actually, it's a really good opportunity to grow our companies as well. I mean, what advice would you give to startup companies looking to work with AWS as well moving forward? And what is it that you're looking out for in companies to partner with?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I've provided kind of a better idea around the kind of different levers that we can pull to support companies. And hopefully that's been educational for people. We're basically at the core, we're kind of an enabler of success for our customers. We provide the underlying infrastructure, like I said, alongside a lot of other support mechanisms. And so I think if you're building on AWS, get in contact with your account manager, who's the point of contact here. They can bring in the right resources and then learn from us around how we can better be a catalyst for your growth and support your business. We also have a lot of resources available through our startup pages, through the Activate console that maybe we can talk about a little bit because it's relevant to early stage companies in a minute, that help companies get set up and started quickly on AWS. And finally, come and meet us. We run a lot of events and gatherings. For example, in October in London, we're running a Gen AI focused loft, which is going to be running for the whole of the month of October in kind of Shoreditch. We have a dedicated day during that period for regulated industries, including fintech. And so there'll be some presentations there'll be workshops, there'll be networking, and we continue to run similar events on a regular basis. So I share most of the stuff on my LinkedIn, but the stuff is also available elsewhere. And so just kind of think of us as that kind of enabler, and we can kind of drive success. And what we're looking out for is really any company that is looking to be successful. Obviously, based on their stage, we provide different levels of support, but anyone can build an AWS. You need a credit card, and then you can start building, and then just tap into the right supporters you needed.
Great. Yeah. And you briefly mentioned the Activate program there, but just to finish off, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Activate program is our pioneer startup program that helps startups build on the AWS cloud. We provide credits, we provide a bunch of other support, including web-based learning. And this helps startups to experiment with different technologies on AWS with little or no upfront cost to develop their solutions. And it's been a very widely used program. So since its inception back in 2013, Activate has provided more than $6 billion in credits. And you can almost think about that as an AWS giving back to the ecosystem to over 280,000 startups globally. So those are really significant numbers. And many of them, of course, are fintechs. And the rate at which we're providing Activate is only increasing over time. So, for example, in the last 4 years, each of the last 4 years, we've provided $1 billion annually through Activate. And now we have a new startup signing up every 10 minutes. And so if you're listening to this and thinking, Activate it's a very kind of boutique program that's not for everyone. Of course, there are milestones you have to go through to get access, but we're having a new signing up every single 10 minutes. And so it's a widely used program. And so, just again, we have a lot of information. There's an Activate page available online if people want to learn more.
Thanks again, Sam, for chatting with us today. To close out the podcast, we have our now infamous Fintech Jail. So this is where we ask for an industry term, buzzword, or trend that you've seen or heard enough of. Or, of course, you can advocate to free one of the previously incarcerated terms. So what would your selection be for this week?
Yeah, I was kind of looking forward to this question. So I saw that someone had previously put in the Uber of into the jail. And I thought I'd follow suit and put in the AWS of fintech into the jail, which is a term that I hear used regularly. Of course, I'm not massively against the term in principle. In fact, it's actually quite flattering. But there's a kind of a couple of reasons that I'd like to put it in the jail. Firstly, fintechs have awesome products. So they have great brands, and these brands stand alone without needing a comparison. And secondly, it'd be remiss of me not to mention my position that at AWS, as I mentioned, we have a dedicated focus on fintech. And so for me, AWS is the AWS for fintech. And for good reason, right? So we're the support team. We're happy to have this role, and we like to shine a light on our customers for the great things they do.
Excellent. Yeah. So, how often do you hear this one being said then? Is this something that you hear kind of companies that want to work with AWS saying, or is this more just how people are defining other companies?
No, they normally use it to describe themselves. So obviously AWS has been wildly successful, and we provide this kind of infrastructure enabling functionality. And so if you're operating at that kind of infrastructure level within fintech and scaling quickly, people will often drop it in there, which is why it's flattering. But again, I think these companies have awesome brands on their own. And so I'd love to hear someone say, I'm the X for like something else. I'm the Stripe for healthcare or something. I want to see more kind of attention on the great stuff our fintech customers are doing.
Excellent. No, yeah, definitely. I think you've made a good case for it, Ked, there. So I'm happy to add this one to the jail. And hopefully in doing so, it'll mean you'll stop hearing it quite so much going forward. But Sam, thank you so much again for joining us for the podcast today. It's been a pleasure.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks, of course, to Sam for joining me. As for FinTech Futures, you can find us online at fintechfutures.com, on X at FinTech Futures, and of course on LinkedIn. If you like this podcast and our other episodes, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcasting service to get notified about future episodes. Thanks as well to Arama for editing this podcast. You can check them out at arama.tv. As always, thank you very much for your support, and we'll see you soon for another episode of What the FinTech. But until then, goodbye.